I hope it's okay to name the company because this is all in the public domain. Google has incomes from the UK which exceeds income in Germany or in France, but Germany and France actually collect more taxes from Google than the UK does. So this raised an issue in the UK, and it was also discussed in the British Parliament, and this came out very recently. The point being that big multinational companies, especially technology companies, through a maze of how they structure the deals, have been able to avoid taxes. And I think the Indian government recognizes this, Ministry of Finance has recognized this, and has imposed this equalization levy. How this will evolve in terms of how this will affect domestic companies, like Snapdeal and Flipkart, and how this will affect Google. And some people, if you read the newspapers, some people are saying it'll just gross up, which means that Facebook and Google will start charging amounts which includes the 6% levy, so it'll gross up, and it'll actually affect the startups and the small entrepreneurs in India much more than it'll affect the multinationals. But this is essentially what the government is calling an equalization levy. So this is, I think, a big new change in this budget. Shekhar has also already talked about infrastructure, so I won't really go into that. Disinvestment, given the environment, there's been a cut of the target. And interestingly, a number that one should kind of be worried about is that most of the government's disinvestment that has been done in the recent past has been bought by LIC. So LIC is holding a lot of the shares that have been disinvestment. That could be a cause for concerns. So I will conclude. I want to make a couple of points which I said, what are the good things in this budget, as Rathin already mentioned, and what are the kind of mechanisms put in place to implement what the government has notified in this budget. I've talked about the trade vulnerabilities and the fact that our trade really is not completely being affected by global weaknesses. To an extent it is, but to an extent it is also affected by our own overvaluation of the exchange rate, and I dare say some other inefficiencies in the production. And Shekhar alluded to this, and happy to pick this up in the discussion, India's lack of participation in global value chains, logistics, and so on. So all of that probably play a role. I'm just going to wrap up to say that, there are these 300 clusters on urban, smart cities, digital India. They're all in some way interconnected. And I just want to read out a couple of things from the summary document of the budget, which Rathin referred to as the good things, governance and ease of doing business. And he says the task force has been constituted for rationalization of human resources in various ministries. And what one means by rationalization, we will kind of get to know whether rationalization means downsizing or rationalization means improving human capital, human capacity. That's an important distinction. And I think we need better capacity, as Shekhar also mentioned, not only at the center, but at the state, and much more importantly, when we talk about cities, when we talk about governance, at the local level, at the municipal level, and that's where I think the capacity is the leanest. And this was an opportunity, as I said, to try and allocate some money for human capital development at the local level. Focusing on urban, while it's good, I think it could be a non-starter for a couple of reasons. And the reason urban could be a non-starter, if you recall Pura number of years ago, provision of urban amenities in rural areas. And if the intention is to stop migration from rural to urban areas by providing them employment opportunities there, it's going to be insufficient to start with. So there is going to be migration. We need to improve our cities. We need to improve our urban areas. But I think cities is where jobs are going to be provided. Cities is where people are going to be living in. And the numbers show that by 2020, I may be off by a few percentage points, not by 2020, in 20 years, in 2 decades, 75% of India's GDP is going to come from cities. 70% of net new jobs are going to be in cities. And, so urban, creating these clusters, maybe for transitory reasons, but the focus has to be on cities, and that's where the implementation capacity has to be improved a lot. Digital India is again the focus of this government. I'm finishing. Digital India is the focus of this government. Unfortunately, one of the biggest weaknesses, I think, of the Digital India, the direct benefit transfer schemes, all of that nice architecture that has been laid out to rationalize subsidies, and if it happens, great. But one of the biggest weaknesses of Digital India not rolling out as fast as it could is because for the last decade, we haven't been able to get connectivity to the Gram Panchayats that Sam Petroda had promised almost 10 years ago under what was called the National Optical Fiber Network. We have the money, and you don't need the money for the budget because the telecom sector cess, another cess, is already existent, and it has billions of dollars lying in what is called the USOF. And that cannot be, although I don't know what's happened to the fate of it, but the Act says that it cannot be appropriated by Parliament unless there is a vote in Parliament to appropriate that. And I don't know whether that vote has taken place or not, but there is huge amounts of money lying in the USOF. But the problem is not the money, the problem is the capacity and the procurement processes that haven't been possible to implement the NOFN. And I think NOFN, the National Optical Fiber Network, is the backbone for all these digital programs in India, especially in rural areas where connectivity suffers. So I think that needs, on a kind of war footing, that needs to be rolled out. I'm told DOT has started that process, and I wish them success because it's failed for a number of years. And then, of course, capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajat. We now come to the last and perhaps the most interesting presentation. This is going to be on the politics of the budget.
He said, very good, doctor. I said, why? He said, did not administer any injections. The question is asked, but will the doctor cure you? He said, that I don't know. And I actually am getting a little worried listening to my colleagues, whether this budget has that quality. I agree with them. I think the temptation not to spend money, good thing. There's a lot of interesting institutional stuff in the budget, which if it is followed through, new dispute resolution mechanism for PPP, some good tax reforms, some good SME stuff, it's a whole bunch of stuff, Aadhaar potentially, if that kind of finally, that, in the long run could begin to address some, I think what Manish has called sort of chronic problems rather than acute problems. What I don't know, and I think this pertains to the politics of this and the psychology of the budget, is what's the problem the budget is trying to fix, and is it adequate to fixing that problem? I think that's the test. We've done the mathematical test of the budget, as it were, right? So let me first lay that out, and I know this is a controversial thing to say in the company of economists, but most of us ordinary citizens, and I think the globe, is very confused about what exactly is wrong with us. When you say 7 to 7.75%, there's actually nothing terribly wrong with us, right? Now, of course, we know it's under the new series, and of course we know, that's perfectly fine, but it doesn't feel like a 7.5% economy to anybody. And the government has caught itself in a bind, because if you had said our growth is 4.8% or 5%, then you would come up with a different diagnosis. Then the case for public investment, then the case for stimulating demand is there. We are so much into this management because we want to say that we don't actually have a crisis. We are the best growing economy in the world, right? So 7.75. Now, once you put yourself into that trap, you actually can't ask very hard questions about how much of a deep hole are you actually in. So my first political problem with the budget, and I think it's a problem in the perception of this budget, is actually there is no honesty about that. The economic survey is actually very clear that we are in a really, really deep hole, right? But everything, every assumption you have made about what needs to be fixed cannot acknowledge that deep hole. Okay? So that's the first problem, and I think it is a political problem. It is a political problem because the only thing you can claim credit for is that we have 7 to 7.5 growth. right? That's the headline of the last 2 years of economic achievement, very little else, right? So I'm afraid the politics has contaminated the economic presentation of the argument, and I think as intellectuals we are collaborating with that, frankly. Okay? The second thing that worries me about this budget, and there it's not a worry about the budget itself. In fact, I think the budget is actually, I'd say it's reflecting actually a deeply pessimistic psychology about India. Okay, and I think one should lay that pessimism on the table. Why is it pessimistic? Why have we restrained ourselves in public spending, right? And of course, there's the issue of states will do more of it. I actually think the one thing politicians are right about, and I think this is nobody saying this, but this is the underlying assumption, is public spending, even consumption spending, will have to explode over the next 2 years. The rural distress, unless we are lucky with a great monsoon this year, is going to deepen. The follow-through of the 7th Pay Commission for states is always immensely disruptive. Rathin knows this, that there's been more devolution to the states in terms of the Finance Commission allocations. But the sorting out of the state's committed liabilities under all centrally sponsored schemes, most state governments actually don't know how much money they're going to have compared to their liabilities over the next 2 or 3 years. So I think implicitly, and this is a good reason to be prudent right now, but implicitly the government is actually acknowledging we actually don't know how this revenue stuff is going to pan out over the next 2 or 3 years. I won't celebrate too prematurely this cutting down on revenue. I think the politicians, I think understand that this dynamic is actually not looking good over the next 2 or 3 years. Okay? And we don't have, in a sense, a sort of a, so it's pessimistic in that sense. Okay? What seems like an achievement is born out of deep pessimism on the revenue. It's pessimistic in a second sense, which is there's no underlying sense of the diagnosis. And if one were being fair to the government, we could say something like the following, which is, certainly the global uncertainty is playing a big part in the lack of revival of private investment. I mean, we are entering into uncharted waters, right? And again, the government was a prisoner of its own mythology. Slowdown of China is good for us. The slowdown of any major economy in the world is not good for anybody else in the world, okay? Now, and we are entering into uncharted global deflation, competitive devaluations of a different kind are back. If you were private capital, your biggest question, I just don't know what world I'm entering in, right? So that's one hypothesis for why private investment is not picking up. Second hypothesis for private investment is, of course, all the crony capitalist story, the stuck assets, whether we have mechanisms for renegotiating that. And it's different in different sectors. In real estate, it's an entirely a crony capitalist story, right? And the emphasis in this budget on trying to sort of rescue the real estate sector with even more concessions, rather than getting the DLFs and the Unitex of the world to come to heel and drive hard bargains, is quite worrying. A lot of money in an incredibly corrupt, malpriced sector, right? And this is the one sector that has got the biggest infusion in tax base in this budget. So I'm not too happy about that part of it. The other side, renegotiative assets in the power sector and stuff, the government has been slow on it. To its credit, it's recognized the problem, but let's be clear, this is at least a 2-year process. Partly because Indian capital, I think, is slow to wake up to the new realities of India, right? I think the Indian state will actually become more regulatorily consistent. I don't think Indian capital is ready to play by the new transparent rules. So it's like who blinks first, and looks like in the real estate, the government has blinked first. Okay? Third sense in which it's a deeply pessimistic budget, absolutely everybody talks about state capacity. Rajat rightly mentioned it. There is no getting around the fact that state capacity is going to cost a lot of money upfront. We have been deluding ourselves. Of course, there's a problem of inefficiency and some misallocation within the state. But you're living in a fool's paradise, right? If you think you can build state capacity with it without investing in the state, basic sovereign functions, law and justice, right? Where is the investment, right? Basic sovereign functions like police, where is the investment? Basic sovereign functions, capacity building at the lower level, where is the investment? There is no strategy for the state. And you cannot think of a 21st century successful economy without a strategy for the state. All we have heard,